Hello, David.
Hi there.
Nice to meet you. We've never talked before. I got your name on Twitter. I asked who should I talk to about the sacred, and somebody mentioned your name. So I thought, why not ask you? And lucky you were kind enough to say yes. So that's where we came from. That's all our background is. So over the last year, I tried to do some academic study of the sacred, and I came to some tentative conclusions, but I'm more interested in just talking with someone about the subject for whom it's important. Other people I talk to, it's not so important. Right. And I thought you would get a different perspective, at least for someone for whom it really matters.
I think, both for whom it really matters and therefore somebody that's thought about it, because obviously, if it matters to you, you tend to give it more thought than if it's a matter of indifference to you. So
indeed. So at the highest level, I guess I realize that the first question is, can we talk about this phenomena sort of as a neutral observer that people tend to treat some things as sacred? That's where I might start as a social scientist, is say there's this phenomena, and I try to just collect correlates. That is, what do people say tends to go along with this thing? And when I started to talk to some people about this, I realized, well, there's sort of two different ways people think about this. A social scientist, many of us might think there's just this human capacity for treating some things as sacred. Right. And apparently it's flexible in the sense that it seems to have been applied to many things over time in many contexts. And we might just ask, why would humans have this general capacity? What's it for? What is the essence of it? And then, what directs it over time and space to where it goes? And I realized some people were resistant to this framing. They didn't like that because in their mind, there was the one true sacred thing.
Right.
And that's the thing that deserves to be called sacred. And all the other things we treat as sacred are, bad imitations of that, or sort of accidents where we look for the sacred in the wrong place and we try to find it, but we fail. And so in their minds, they want to see this big asymmetry. There is what the sacred is like when it's applied to its proper target.
Right. And
then there's what the sacred is like when people misapply it. That you can see is somewhat of an obstacle to my attempt to just collect the description of the phenomena neutrally and analyze it. So I thought I might just ask you right from the beginning, whether you're willing, which of these two framings.
So, I want to untangle it, actually make it three different framings.
Great.
The first is that sometimes the sacred is basically just a sort of linguistic force multiplier. That is, somebody thinks something is really important and they know the word sacred makes it in some way inviolable, so they say it's sacred. But they don't really mean sacred the way that you talked about in the paper that I read. Sacred is something that is somehow different from the everyday or the normal in some sense. And it's true that my initial reaction to the study of sacred as a social science term is that I believe it refers to something beyond this world. Now, that's not, obviously, we're not going to be able to litigate that here. I can talk about it in the way that it functions in human beings, but at least for me, it has a real referent. That is, sacred is something that in one way or another is tied to, derives from, reaches towards God. And so to say that other things are sacred is a kind of different it's a use of sacred to denote this is deeply important to me or matters a lot to me, as opposed to sacred, which I think of as tied to transcendence.
So I'm not disagreeing with you or agreeing with that at the moment. I want to set it aside, at least temporarily, and just say, well, I seem to be able to collect a list of correlates that go beyond merely treating something as important in terms of how people treat things as sacred. So, for example, they like it to be set apart and not mixed up with profane things.
Which, by the way, I just want to insert the Hebrew word for holy, kadosh, literally means set apart.
Right.
So, yes, exactly so.
So, but we have many other things that we think of are important that we also want to set apart. And we also tend to idealize things that are sacred. That is, we tend to think they are, compared to other things, less dirty, less impure, less more longer lasting, things like that. And there seem to be a number of other correlates of the sacred. So that seems to me my license to talk about a thing is to be able to say, well, look, there's this package of correlates, and I don't have to commit to its origin. I can just talk about it.
I agree. I just wanted to, that was like the theological throat clearing. I just wanted to say that, at least for me, the sacred in my belief system, the sacred actually refers to something beyond. I certainly see that people think of things as sacred in their lives that don't necessarily have any reference to God, and that we can look at those, congeries of ideas and try to figure out why human beings think of certain things as sacred without any theological implication. Yeah, I get that. The only thing I would say on this is that looking at religious systems sometimes complicates the analysis, because what they think of as sacred doesn't always fit with what you might think, it doesn't always get caught in the netting of definitions of sacred outside of those religious traditions. So let me just give you an example that came to mind several times when I was reading what you had written, which is, I remember when I was a rabbinical student, and we had an interfaith conference, which is always interesting, because you grow up in your own tradition and it's a little bit of a bubble, and then all of a sudden you learn all these other things about other traditions. And we were doing the ceremony that ends the Sabbath called Havdalah, and I made the blessing over the wine. And then at the end of it, the tradition is, after you take a sip, you put the candle out in the wine. And one of the Catholic students said, "You can't do that. That's holy wine." And I said, "Not anymore, it isn't." Because it was only holy for when it was a certain function, but afterwards not. And so the sanctity changed just like that when the functionality was over. So those are two different conceptions of the sacred, and I'm not sure how well they fit together.
So I guess we can distinguish three things, perhaps. We could just distinguish the general phenomena of people treating some things as sacred. We could talk about religion in general as a way of dealing with the sacred, and we could talk about Judaism in particular. The first question might just be, do we think that there was this general function of the sacred, and then religion harnessed it and used it for something valuable and important, but that the concept of the sacred was from some sort of prior concept of a sort of way humans have treated things that were very important to them? Or we could think that religion caused the concept of the sacred. That is, first there was the concept of important things, and then religion was the most important thing, and then these other ways of treating the sacred came along with that, and then we've later on perverted that somehow by applying it to other things other than its original purpose.
So I think, and I suspect you agree, that human beings always had some idea of things as sacred, and that obviously religions differ on what that is, but you can study nonetheless the idea of the sacred and how it functions in different traditions and find commonalities. And also, as you said, with secular, with non-religious ideas of the sacred, there are going to be a lot of commonalities with religious ideas of the sacred. So yeah, I think, as long as human beings do it, it can be studied as a human phenomenon, even if some of us think the origin might be somewhere else.
So, in our recent history of our culture, religion did sort of organize the sacred as a central way. And then religion has declined substantially in cultural influence over the last few centuries, yet the sacred remains. And so in some sense, we have this remaining set of things we treat as sacred, but I would say in a less integrated, organized way. That is, religion sort of had this framework of saying what were all the sacred things and why, and how you could tell, because religion told you which things were sacred and why.
Right.
Whereas now we just have a bunch of things we treat as sacred. We don't have a unifying framework that tells us what these are and why, but we still have a lot of things we treat as sacred.
Yes, right, exactly so. And different, this goes back a little bit to, I think, to Jonathan Haidt's work about how different, ideologies treat different things as sacred. So we do, but I'm not sure. I don't know how much what is sacred is culturally conditioned as opposed to, sort of inbuilt in us.
Right. So I mean, the simple the social hypothesis that I've been thinking in terms of is that we have this need for the sacred and a capacity for it, but its particular targets are more set by a local history and culture. Yeah. And then we can think about, as examples, our recent cultures and what do we now in the large shared culture treat as most sacred? And, how has that changed over recent decades?
So just this morning, I offered a prayer at a Memorial Day commemoration, and you want to see the sacred in in action. There's the flag and the soldiers and the prayers over the dead, and that was a sort of, that was like an entire gathering of secular sacred combined in a lot of ways. And so I wonder how you would analyze that. Why is that sacred? Like, what is it about something like a Memorial Day service that makes people think of it not just as important, but as sacred?
So nationalism was in some sense sacred to people, at least a few centuries ago. Their devotion to their nation was in many ways nearly as strong as their devotion to their religion.
Right.
And wars have, reaffirmed the sacredness of nationalism. And, basically war is the context in which we are most called on to affirm our national, our sacred allegiance to our nation. And, flags and, national holidays and things like that are more of the concrete versions of the, how we remind ourselves of that and connect ourselves to those things.
So level of importance is crucial, right? There's nothing sacred that isn't important. And nobody says it's sacred, but right. I don't care.
So, I mean, you might think evil is sacred, but it's negatively important. But there's a sense in which evil is quite literally sacred.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's not always a positive value, but it's a strong value.
No, in Rudolf Otto's Idea of the Holy, which is like a classic book about holiness and religion, I think it was written in the 20s or 30s by a Protestant theologian. He talks about mysterium tremendum, the tremendous mystery. And you get things like, when someone touches the ark, which will be familiar to those from, Raiders of the Lost Ark, when someone touches the ark in the Bible and they essentially get electrocuted. I mean, that's what it feels like, and they fall down dead. Yes, there is a power to sanctity that can be, sometimes good or bad. There is something clearly about the mystery and inexplicability of evil that gives it some of the same patina of beyondness.
So I realize I should just say that my family is very religious, even though I'm not. Just if you want to know who I am and where I come from. My father was a pastor of a church. My mother writes Christian tween novels. They were missionaries together for years. My brother, ran the music at my father's church. My other brother has his own church. So I have a strong religious background, and I was, in some sense, joined a cult when I was a tween. That my parents pulled me away from. And then only in college, as I learned physics, did I become more of an atheist. But culturally, I have a strong religious background. So I remember very much what it was like to be very religious. And, that's an anchor I can use to think about how these things work and how they feel.
And you did talk, you haven't introduced your sort of overarching theory of what is sacred. Did you want to do that?
I'm not sure. Well, I guess I thought it might be. I mean, we could, but I thought it might be fun to think about sort of what's most sacred today in society and how that's beat out. So there's a sense in which in our world we have a bunch of things we treat as sacred, and then when we see them in conflict, this is a bit of a problem because our norm of the sacred is sacred things shouldn't be in conflict.
Yes.
They should
That's
all
right.
be able to be achieved together, right?
Right.
And
Exactly.
so I think, for example, one of the biggest things we treated as sacred is romance. And that's been a problem because we also treated marriage as sacred.
Right.
And then when we saw a conflict between those things, that was an important moment in our culture where people had to choose, in some sense, which was more sacred, romance or marriage. And, you know, the traditional from centuries ago point of view was it was marriage that was sacred. Romance was nice, but that wasn't the important thing. And then we changed our mind about that in some sense and made romance be more sacred. And that meant when there was a conflict between romance and marriage, marriage had to go. And so we decided divorce would have to be okay.
Right.
And in some sense, a lot of the emotional energy of, say, identity politics over the last half century is often sort of built around romance. That is, once people who are gay or lesbian said, I need this identity for my romance to be fulfilled,
Right.
people said, I guess you got to get that because that's the most important thing, right? And so
yeah,
go ahead.
I was going to say, so it changed. Like there was a time when social continuity and social structures were sort of the locus of sanctity, and it became the individual human heart that was much more, which is just another way of saying what you said, but that's what became, you know, the sanctity of the individual's heart and ideas. I mean, it's very Emersonian, you know,
Right.
Emerson would not fit with a classical definition of religion because it was about, when you look, for example, at the ketubah, which is the marriage contract or the marriage covenant in Judaism, one of the interesting things is at a wedding I do, so I read part of the ketubah in Aramaic and then I read the English translation, but it's not a translation. It's completely different because it's all about romance and living together and creating a home of love and laughter. And the Aramaic is quite businesslike because this is about setting up, you know, a mini corporation in the society. So yeah, that shift has been very dramatic.
And similarly in careers, you know, our sacred career is the one that fulfills us now. Right. And making money and supporting a family and those other sorts of things are sort of secondary in some sense. And we celebrate the person who follows their dream more than the one who, you know, supports their family.
Right.
And that's a similar sort of change where, you know, we said, okay, I guess, you know, you need to change careers, then I guess you need to, because that's the most important thing.
Right.
And I would even presume that when you're making a pitch to people about religion, you also are going to be somewhat forced to frame it in these new terms rather than the old terms. That is, centuries ago, you may have reframed it as, this is your society, right. This is your family, this is our religion, therefore that should be yours too. And right. Now you might tell them, this will fulfill you, this will make your heart pitter patter, as a different sort of pitch, right?
It is a different pitch. I have written about how, you know, religion is different from spirituality, because religion, you know, religion is not only about you, religion is about the community, religion is about, and I think in some ways we have lost a lot by always emphasizing the individual spiritual quest. I always say when somebody tells me they're spiritual but not religious, I want to know how much they give to charity, because the question, religion right. imposes certain obligations that you owe to others, spirituality does not. I mean, that you right. could be obviously spiritual and incredibly giving, but that's not part and parcel of it. Whereas if you follow a religious community, you find that almost inevitably there's a certain amount of giving that's expected. So yeah, it's tricky, and it's getting harder, not easier, as religious communities decline and means of satisfying yourself individually as opposed to communally grow with technology, even though I think it's probably not ultimately as healthy or as satisfying.
But it is more what our society treats as the most sacred.
Yeah,
and
is.
a minority community has to at least acknowledge the majority's priorities when trying to recruit people to say,
no question.
Yes,
I say all the time. I mean, it used to be when you asked somebody in the Jewish tradition, why do I have to do this? The answer was because God said so, which made it actually a very easy explanatory.
Yes.
But now, as you say, you have to say because it'll fulfill your life, it'll be good for you, it'll do this, it'll do that, it'll tie you to your people, to your history, and that is a much harder sell than, oh, by the way, the creator of the universe said you have to do this. So that's a radical change in religion, which is one of the reasons I suspect for the rise of fundamentalism in every religion. That is the collapse of the liberal wing of religion and the rise of Hinduism and Christianity, and Judaism and Islam. All the religions have a fundamentalist surge because that system is coherent and compelling.
And it gives the older authority and a more perhaps comforting authority, more compelling authority to many, that it's not just an option for them to choose this route to spirituality, that they are tied to a community in a way that they can't let go and maybe don't want to let go.
Right, exactly.
So I'm especially interested in, and you probably are too, I see a trade-off in treating something as sacred versus not, and thinking about the costs as well as the benefits of that. And so maybe that's where I should just quickly review my account of the sacred and see if you disagree, because it's a basis at least for adding up these costs and benefits. So I'm starting with Emil Durkheim's story long ago, a famous sociologist, saying that the main social function of the sacred was to bind a community together around shared values. And so that predicts that people would highly value sacred things, that they would want to show they valued them through sacrifice and emotions and other sorts of public demonstrations, and that they would in fact, care about the sacred allegiances of other people in their community, and they would want to, be bound together by that. But then there's 4 other correlates of the sacred that aren't predicted just by these 3. One is that we set the sacred apart, as we said before. Another is that we idealize the sacred, we simplify it and take away impurities and etc. of it. It is, made more perfect in our minds. We have the norm that we are supposed to intuit, feel the force, Luke, and not calculate it. Although that's somewhat at odds with some kinds of religious practice, but it seems to be a common correlate of the sacred, is that you're supposed to fundamentally go with the feeling. And lastly, there's this correlate whereby abstract sacred things make other things sacred through contact. So a love letter is a sacred representation of your love, a flag, a sacred representation of a nation, a Torah, a sacred representation of religion. And my explanation for these other 4 correlates is that they can be predicted from this basic theory that the sacred is a way communities come together by invoking a psychology account called construal level theory, which is about how we see things as near or far, and we treat them differently. And the idea is that this near versus far thing is an obstacle for a community seeing something the same, because say if medicine is sacred and I'm sick and you're not, you will see my medical treatment from afar, and I will see it up close. And if those things give us a different view, then that will be an obstacle to us being bound together by a common view of it. And so the theory is that for sacred things, we instead decide to see them as if from afar, even when they're close, so that we can all see them the same. And that's my simple account of the sacred. And that lets us, if we accept it provisionally at least, talk about the trade-offs of which, what the benefits of treating something as sacred are and what the costs. But let me pause to ask you.
Yeah. So first of all, I found it really intriguing and very interesting. Reading the paper, and it's obviously there's more in the paper even than you have the chance to say. One thing I did want to ask you about at the outset is, I just recently read the new biography of Derek Parfit, And obviously he was very taken up with these questions of near and far, and the bias of the near. And like, if somebody, if a kid next to you is starving, of course you feed him, but there's a kid starving in Africa, and it doesn't even make a dent in your day. And what intrigued me about this is that in your account of the sacred and far, far is more important. In his account of the bias of the near, far is less important. And I couldn't quite come to the right distinction between those two. I think they're both correct in each of your accounts. But what do you think that makes yours more important in the sacred and his less important in the child in trouble?
I do think that one of the correlates of near versus far in construal level theory is that near things are just more important to you. That is, near things can really terrify you or excite you and overwhelm you even. And when you see things from far away in far mode, it's more of a serene, relaxed, accepting view of things, but it's less strongly motivated. And that's a typical correlate of near versus far in psychology. So I'm not making this up. This is just from psychology. So that is, in some sense, a risk or a cost that the sacred does. If sacred takes away the near version of things, then you are literally less intensely motivated. But that might overcome some other problems. So let's think of medicine as sacred, for example. Because we treat medicine as sacred, then we tend to take this far view of medicine. And this far view of medicine makes us less terrified in a moment of medical decision and treatment. It's a way of calming us down and letting us step back and, make some calmer decisions on the one hand. On the other hand, it makes us less attentive and careful about our medical treatment. We often just accept whatever our doctor says to do, and we don't want to think about it, and we just want to trust them. And we make simplified categorizations of medicine, and we're just much less interested in going in the details of a medical choice, in part because we treat it as sacred and see it from afar. So that might be a concrete example of some of the trade-offs. By treating medicine as sacred, we as a community can unite around the idea that everybody should get medicine, and that medicine is good and we're all going to support it. And that's a feature of our society, that is, we do generally, agree with that idea. It didn't have to be true. But on the other hand, and because we agree it's sacred, from a far view, we're willing to say it's very important. And like when we're voting, and it hardly costs us anything personally, we will say, yes, it's important, and give lip service to that. But there's a sense in which when you are directly confronted with a medical problem, you are just less motivated. You're less intensely activated, which again, it overcomes at least some of your way you could be overactivated, so horrified, so anxious that you're frozen and you can't do anything. But it does have this cost of weakening your motives.
Well, also, I think that medicine's an interesting example because it's sort of derivatively sacred. Why is medicine sacred? It's sacred because human life is sacred. If human life wasn't sacred, medicine wouldn't be sacred.
Although many other things that affect life aren't so sacred. So that's a puzzle for those of us who teach health economics, for example. When we talk about nutrition and air quality and sleep and exercise, people just get bored with that, and they don't see exercise as sacred, even if exercise has a much stronger correlation with health than medicine does. So in some sense, medicine is much more sacred than the other things that affect health.
Although I live in Los Angeles, some people here see exercise as sacred. So I
yes, some do. All right,
but also there is tied to the sacred. There can be a greater motivation in the following. One of my colleagues once pointed out to me. He said, I know people who are overweight and shouldn't eat that piece of cake, and know they shouldn't, and they know it's bad for their health, but they eat, or they have diabetes, but they eat it. But if you told them that there was pig product in that, they wouldn't touch it.
Right.
Because the idea of the sacred system of rules is more powerful than even their own health. So it's a very complicated and nuanced question.
So the key thing would be there, whatever sacred rule they're going to have about food, it's going to be relatively simple and stark. That's one of the features of the sacred. Because the sacred is idealized and set apart, there's going to be some relatively simple rules, and they're just going to be followed consistently. And those rules really aren't going to be able to account for a lot of variety and detail. So that's one of the costs of treating the things as sacred. For example, even in medicine, there's a bunch of things that are sort of half medicine and half other things, and we're not very comfortable with that. We want it to be medicine or not, because we want that sharp set apart distinction.
They're stark, but they can be very detailed. I mean, the laws of keeping kosher are extremely detailed, but it may be stark what is and what isn't. The dividing lines are fairly clear, but they can be very, very detailed. And anyway, so
here's another example to walk through, which is, say, the difference between sex and love.
Right.
So in some sense, in our society at least, sex is somewhat sacred, but mainly via its association with love or with procreation.
Yeah.
And so with sex, we more feel differently about it depending on its proximity to us. So, in the moment, you feel and think about it very differently than thinking about somebody else's moment at some other place and time described abstractly. So we are less treating it as sacred in the sense of seeing it from afar. We don't see sex so much from afar. At least we don't all see it from afar all the time. At least some of the time we see it up close very directly, and then we see it differently in that moment. But with love, we more have this phenomena where even if we are in love at this moment, we see it as if from afar. So we're not so sure what it means, or whether we really are in love, or what it would look like to be in love. Even when we've been in love for decades, we have this view from afar of love, such that we're not so sure what the details are, but it lets us all agree that love is good because we see it from afar.
I'm not sure if this applies exactly, but the distinction between sex and love, which is this distinction sort of between the physical / mechanical and the ethereal / emotional, which makes one easier to be sacred than not. I think also to some extent, this is an influence of Christianity. And the reason I say that is the biggest difference between Judaism and Christianity, and by the way, in this Islam is very much like Judaism, is these are religions that grew up in the desert. So civil law and religious law were one. They were the same thing. Christianity grew up in the Roman Empire. So civil law was already taken care of, and religious law became a much more internal, spiritual question. It wasn't a question of what happens when his ox scores your ox, because the Roman courts took care of that. And so there is, and because we live in a Christian society, I think there's a tendency to the internalization and etherealization of things that are spiritual, whereas to some extent, it might be that in societies that are constructed on religious law, you might get more of a mixing of the two. This is just like, I'm saying this speculatively, but it's an interesting thing to think about.
So for the purpose here, though, does this make a difference with respect to the near versus far view of things, and whether we see them differently near versus far?
I don't know. I haven't. It might not. Although the sex versus love thing was what made me think about it in a sense, because the reason that we think of love as more, as I said, it's because it's more.
Right.
It's less physical. It's almost like physical things don't seem as sacred as often as symbolic things or spiritual things,
So we could say that in the past it was marriage that was more sacred and love less so. And so then we might talk about sex versus marriage, and we still might say marriage we shared a view of, that as a whole society agreed about marriage being good, and we could all agree on that even if we saw it up close versus far away. And that would be marriage being sacred. And then the sex itself would be less sacred. And we would be allowing ourselves to see it differently in the moment than from far away.
Yeah. And I also think that, like, just the idea of an intangible God probably suggests that sanctity tends to be more of the non-physical. Like what we think of as sacred is not what you can touch or see and feel nearly as much. I mean, there's some of it,
Right.
but nearly as much as things that you can't. And I suppose things that you can't touch or see or feel are by definition farther away.
So, for example, our society treats democracy as relatively sacred.
Right.
And it's not physical.
Right. Exactly.
And interestingly, if you ask people what is the definition of democracy, they get all befuddled, because it's a sort of thing, again, they see from afar.
Right.
Right. That is, they have this abstract sense that they agree that democracy is good, but then when you say, well, what does it take to be a democracy, they're not so sure.
No.
And that's a way in which, again, we value democracy, but then we're not very attentive to its details. It would be a way I'd say the cost. That is, this style of treating things as if from afar means that you're sloppy about the details.
Is there, I mean, in religion there is, but in non-religious views of the sacred, do you think that there is a source of sanctity? I was going to say human life, but then I remembered that I just came from a Memorial Day service where people died in service of something they thought was greater.
Yes, indeed. So that's part of the interesting phenomena that once upon a time, religion was this unified theory of the sacred for people. And then as religion have declined, we've still maintained a bunch of other things as sacred, but we no longer have this unified account of why they're sacred or which ones are priority. So we more just fight over which is the priority in some sense. And we don't have a shared accepted theory of why.
No.
But I mean, you could use that as a critique to say, therefore, that's not really sacred things, or you could just say that's the nature of the sacred, that, we just come to accept whatever we treat as sacred. So Durkheim's theory was something like, a group of people, you could come together and say, I'm with you, you're with me. My biggest priority in life is you and the group, and I will devote myself to the group. And if you do that, now you're sort of at risk for, political ventures. Someone says, I'm the leader of the group, therefore you should just be on with me. And that humans found it more convenient to all pick a thing outside the group and say, we're all into that. So there's the sacred tree. We all say, we think the sacred tree is the most important thing. And we are the people who all agree that the sacred tree is the most important thing. And that binds us together. And so we bind to each other indirectly through the thing that we agree together is sacred. And in that sense, we could pick a lot of different things and have it work out. And people have over time picked a lot of different things as the thing they agree about. And under that theory, there isn't necessarily going to be some coherent theory of why it's a sacred tree and not a sacred grassland or a sacred pond or a sacred bird. It's just going to be, the key thing is we agreed that this was the sacred thing. And after years and generations of agreeing with that, then it feels very compelling to us that we are focused on the tree. And anybody who comes in to hurt our tree, we're going to resist them. And that's how we will come together to help each other, is through this shared object of the thing we are venerating.
And do you think that just like, Weber's disenchantment, that there's a decrease of the sense of the sacred in modern society, or do you think it just shifted?
I can't tell, but I guess my simplest theory is that it's just shifted. So certainly, like, people are really much more intensely, they call it religious, about politics these days. That is, in some sense, we were living in an era of a religious, they would call it revival, except it's not religion, but it's an ideologies that have the passion and energy of religion. And, that looks really strong. And simply, people's identity politics, they seem to be have very strong feelings toward that and very sacred treatment of that. I don't know that I.
Okay, so what makes it sacred? When you use the word sacred in regard to I agree that there's an obsessive, almost fanatical adherence to certain political views on different sides. What makes it sacred, though? It's just the coherence,
just the correlates. The other correlates fit. Right. If you go through the other, so in my paper, we discussed that I have 64 correlates.
Right.
And you go through and say, there's an awful lot of these correlates. It's not just that they're valuing it in a way that they don't want to call into question, that they have sacred icons that are contact of that make that, they especially revere, that they want to set it apart. They don't want to have compromises on it. They idealize it in many ways. Those correlates of the sacred do seem to be going, and they also, are resistant to analysis. They say you should just feel this. You shouldn't be analyzing this. I mean, so for example, somebody tweeted that, in high school, their teacher had them analyze, write an essay from the point of view or debate from the point of view of arguing for slavery. And somebody today says, that's just terrible. Nobody should ever think in those terms. Nobody should ever analyze it from that other point of view. They should only, have the one point of view that slavery is bad, and that should be the end of it. And that's sort of an attitude of, that's not a thing you should be thinking about. That's a thing you should just know the right feeling for and be done with it.
Right. So it's very hard then for a society, if the sacred is intended to create group coherence, and different groups have different conceptions of the sacred.
Yes.
This is not good. This is a problem.
So this is a problem with, I guess, liberalism in a certain sense. That is, the idea of a society that allows different sub-communities to have different concepts of the sacred. They're going to have to treat as somewhat sacred some of the ways in which they keep the peace among themselves, right? So there's a sense in which liberalism needs some things to be somewhat sacred about the political order, such that we aren't willing to, violate those.
Right.
Like say, democracy, i.e. your side loses the vote, then you accept you've lost the vote and the other person won. And for now that they will be in charge, right?
The problem is that process things have a hard time being as sacred as, democracy is a sort of process thing. And,
yes.
and it's hard for that to be as sacred as sort of fixed ideals. I think.
Yes, it is. I agree. But people do treat democracy as somewhat sacred in the sense that they idealize it,
right?
And that they set it apart, and they have a number of the other correlates of the sacred. I mean, actually, so I have a PhD in formal political theory.
Right.
So, I spent years analyzing game theory models of politics. And so I basically know that, in fact, people do not have equal political influence, not remotely.
Right.
We have this formal idea that one person, one vote, and everybody has equal political influence. And that's sort of a way we treat it as sacred. We just say, well, ignore all that other stuff. Just notice everybody gets one vote. So therefore, everybody has equal political influence. And therefore, we have a democracy, even though there's all these other factors you're setting aside. So that's to me a clear indication of this sort of sacred treatment, that you are ignoring a bunch of real stuff that adds complexity so that you can simplify your view of it, so that you could treat it as something to revere and not to mess with.
Yeah, it's very, this is, as this is one of the reasons, I suppose, why liberalism has such a problem with nationalism, because it's going to be competing sanctities, and every nation has these inviolable symbols that are really hard to subsume in any other kind of ideal or idea.
Right. So sometimes liberalism can be in conflict with nationalism, right? So two sacred things in conflict. If you think if that party wins, they will, make our nation weak.
Yeah.
And my main priority is to make our nation strong, then I can't accept them winning the vote.
That's right. Yeah. You just can't accept it because it violates the sacred. Is the sacred, in the examples that you've thought of, is it always the absolute? Is there anything that trumps the sacred?
So the thing I've noticed most fundamentally is when people think about the sacred, they think in terms of a thing that has a lot of absolutes, right? There's just rules and there's boundaries and you don't accept any violations, right? But in practice, I have these 64 correlates of the sacred, and they're weak correlates. They're violated all the time.
Yes.
People don't notice that, in fact, they're not applying these, correlates of the sacred strictly and strongly. We accept a lot of compromise. And so that's one of the things to notice about the sacred is that, or even in religion, right? Sin is terrible, but then you end up accepting a lot of sin in the process of being a religious community. And there's just a contradiction at a certain level of, you act as if you have some absolute principles and some absolute boundaries, and then in practice you make a lot of compromises.
It's a great line from the poet William Stafford. He said, if you purify the pond, the water lilies die. You know,
Right.
it's like you can't be too, if you're going to be too unforgiving, then you destroy the system.
So actually, I mean, I don't know what you think about this, but I've come to realize that without religion, when we treat many different things as sacred, we treat them in sacred in ways that make us not think about them very carefully or very analytically and become sloppy about them. And that's messing up a lot of different areas of life. And in some sense, when religion was dominant, it limited the sacred in ways that then didn't mess up a lot of life. So like if you think of nature, say, or the economy, there's a sense in which even today, many people see any sort of touching of nature as something that's sacrilegious. And then any sort of competition where some people lose out economically as sacrilegious, and they're tempted to mess a lot with society and the economy in order to prevent those things because they have sacred sense that just shouldn't be allowed. And when something like Christianity says, you can mess with nature, God said so, go ahead. Or, Christianity says you can compete in business, that's okay. God said, and then people go, oh, I guess my feelings of discomfort should be set aside because God said so. And in some sense, religion like limited the sacred to some part of society and then let the rest of society actually function because it took the sacred away from other things.
That's so interesting because usually the critique, of course, of religion is you're expanding the sacred and you're making, things sacred that aren't sacred, whereas you're pointing out that it leaves a lot of room for non-sanctity, which is a helpful thing for the operations of society, at least for the agreement of society.
So I mean, this is a obviously consequential reason for religion, but I have to admit, well, I got to give religion credit that it limited itself to some, say it had a lot of strong opinions about marriage and raising children and things like that. And so it couldn't allow a lot of evolution or variation within the things that religion declared was its purview. But there were a bunch of other things it said that's okay.
Right.
And today there's less of that. So that is, religion is giving less cover to people feeling very, that they have sacred opinions again about nature or business competition or even free speech. Like once upon a time, go ahead.
I was going to say part of it is because religion made the system sacred, and what we have made sacred is the individual volition much more. So that also, it's a little bit anarchic, the way all of us think of the world now, which is that you can create. I mean, people think you create your own sacred as well. Everybody gets to decide what's sacred for them, and that, in addition to group sanctity, there's individual sanctities.
So one of the correlates of the sacred that I listed in my paper, and I think I see, is that for sacred things, either there are priests who should not be questioned, such as religious priests or doctors, say, in medicine, or there's a norm that that nobody is special, like with democracy, and everybody's opinion counts equally. So those are the two choices I think people have about the sacred. Either there's some priests not to be questioned, or everybody's opinion counts the same. And so we're more often going to that second kind of thing in the last century. When we treat something as sacred now, everybody's opinion counts the same, and there are no experts and there are no authorities. And
I have to say, it's very interesting to be clergy in this atmosphere, because what you get sometimes is when someone wants your opinion to be sacred and they need it for one reason or another, then it is. And other times, sometimes with the same person, if they want to make sure that that your opinion is no better than theirs, so they shift that to, because they have both options open to them, depending on what serves the purpose at the time. And I don't mean that I'm cynical or dismissive. I mean, that's how people work,
but puts you in an awkward position.
It does. Sometimes it's tricky. But I mean, I sort of do the same thing. I just want to say from the other side, which is there are some things that I say, no, this is really what the tradition says. And then at other times I'll say, oh, okay, so the tradition says this, but you should know that, we live in a different world, and so on and so forth.
So I wanted to ask you about this one puzzle of the sacred, at least from the point of view I've been analyzing. So the theory here again is that we seek sacred things from afar in order to see them the same. And one of the correlates of seeing something from afar is you see it more intuitively, emotionally quickly without doing careful analysis. That is, when you do say math, that's in a near mode because you're looking and calculating, whereas when you sort of make an aesthetic judgment is more of a far mode quick thing. When there are experts or priests of a sacred, it seems to be a problem that they have to be more conscious and analytic about their topic than other people would be. That would seem to risk their not seeing it in far mode, because everybody else is supposed to just intuit the sacred and just go along with the shared intuitive feelings about the sacred without being too calculating about it. But the specialists have to be calculating. So that raises the question, do other people trust the specialists to still see it as sacred if they're calculating so much? How do you reassure people that you as a priest of the sacred are feeling it right and aren't losing the touch with the correct feeling, even if you are analyzing and calculating?
My own experience, and a lot of the clergy that I've spoken to about this, is that it is very difficult to sustain a spiritual life as a clergy person. And there are a lot of reasons for that. But one of the reasons is exactly what you say, which is you have to constantly calibrate what will work spiritually for other people. So, I mean, just to make it as simple, in case this sounds abstract, right? During the service, you have to know what page everybody's supposed to be on.
Right.
So you're right. There is a contradiction built into the system of you're the technician of the sacred, but that makes you a technician. So it's really hard to be a technician of the sacred and feel the same sanctity.
Can there be a technician of the sacred? That is, our usual concept of the sacred is the sort of thing you're not supposed to be technical about, right?
That is exactly right. It is absolutely, in a lot of ways, it's a contradiction. And it's, I mean, I could talk a lot about this. I think that but it is certainly the case that contradiction is discussed a lot in literature about clergy and between clergy and so on and so forth, because it really is, it's a very strange dichotomy.
Well, so there's two extreme answers, one of which is, well, they can't maintain that sacred stance toward it, but they just give the appearance and we all sort of accept the appearance for reality and we go along with it because what else are we supposed to do? Or the other is they have some special ability by which they can maintain this sacred relationship to the technicalities that the rest of us don't have, or the rest of us haven't acquired.
My very unsatisfactory answer is it depends on the person and the congregation and the situation.
Both happen.
But I will tell you, for example, I mean, this is, I'm about to retire from my synagogue, and my own personal spiritual life and practice will grow, I think, from that freedom from the technician part. But there are other ways in which you grow by doing that I will not grow, because I won't have to always tend to other people's needs the same way. So there is a trade-off there. But I think that it's true, just in terms of what we would call the sacred, that it's also, by the way, I mean, and this may be off topic, but it also has to do with the function of your own ego. Because when you're in front of a big crowd, it's very hard to feel yourself a vessel and not David in front of a big crowd. And so the operations of your own ego, when people notice that religious leaders sometimes think very well of themselves, it's unsurprising when you're constantly put in a position that you're supposed to be, in some sense, higher, better, no more, so on and so forth, than everybody else. And so there's not just the technical part, there's also the humility and self-awareness part that is really important if you're not going to run away with yourself.
I'll just make a side comment. I have this other podcast with Agnes Callard where we go over many topics. And one of our recent topics is social impossibilities. And it just seems like there's a set of things we do where our definition of them just can't be satisfied. They're just impossible. And yet we just accept what we're given as satisfying them, in a sense. So I would say this is an example that is, you're being asked to do a roughly impossible thing.
So I remember,
And then we just accept that you've done it.
I'll give you one anecdote to feed this, just because it was really formative when I was young. I had no intention of becoming a rabbi. I was at a friend's house. His father had passed away, and I was there. And my father was a rabbi in Philadelphia, really a wonderful man. And I saw this other rabbi, and I happened to have read one of his books. And I said to him, Rabbi so-and-so, I read your book such and such. I really enjoyed it. He said, good. Did you read my other book, this and that? And I said, no, I haven't. And he said, you should. It's a classic. Just like that. And I went over to my father and I said, like, how does this happen? How does somebody? And my father said, for 40 years, every Saturday morning, after you give your sermon, someone will come up to you and tell you, you changed my life. He said, and you really have to know who you are not to believe that after time. And so it's a bizarre combination of like great opportunity to actually do something in people's lives, and great opportunity to distort your own if you're not aware of it.
So one of the ways we could think about sacred things and which things to treat as sacred might be which things are the most immune to distortion if you treat them as sacred, which things are actually set apart and which are idealized. Those things, in some sense, there's less of a harm in the habits of treating them as sacred because your distortions are less of a problem. And there's some sense in which God is like that. That is, God is literally set apart and perfect. And so to the extent you believe he's set apart and perfect, then treating him as that way isn't so much of a problem.
Right. And there are certain core beliefs like the sanctity of human life, which obviously can be, but I mean, it's about as safe a sacred belief.
For human life, we do actually make trade-offs. So
we do.
That's part of the norm of the sacred is you shouldn't make trade-offs between the sacred and profane, but we do actually make lots of trade-offs of life. And so we kind of have to set that aside. We want to make this sharp distinction, but there are sort of intermediate, partially dead situations. And we're uncomfortable with those intermediate situations because we want this nice, clean distinction about life and death.
If we're imperfect creatures, so we can't have a perfect appreciation of sanctity in almost anything, and that's one of the reasons why we so admire sacrifice. Is it feels like for a moment, somebody had a perfect devotion to whatever the sacred ideal was.
Although they didn't have an infinite devotion, they only had enough devotion to make them pay that cost. So you might like to think of it as an infinite devotion, but it really wasn't. That is, if we had asked more of them, they might have said, no, that's too much. we asked just enough of them so that they did it.
That is spoken like a social scientist. What can I tell you?
Right. Well, so on things that are less distorted by treating them as sacred, it has occurred to me that math is something that our society does treat as somewhat sacred. And in fact, it's not a bad target because it is literally set aside and it is literally perfect in certain key ways. It is idealizing math gives you math. There's not much. That's kind of what math is. It's idealizing some things.
Yeah.
And so, our schooling system especially relies very heavily on using math as a way to coordinate on evaluating people and according on how to, as common languages for things. And
can I point out something about math that math and God have in common? Neither of them are products of human beings or the human brain. I mean, at least in theory, if it exists outside of us. So since it exists outside of us, it's easier. And we tend to hypothesize things that we say love exists outside of us too, but it's easier to believe that math does.
Well, as we economists like to think of society as discovering innovations that were always there, that we come along and discover. And so in that sense, innovation is also something that I think we kind of treat as sacred, and it is appropriate more to treat it as sacred.
But I don't know that was always true.
No, it wasn't. This is a feature of the modern world.
This was Daniel Boorstin, actually, used to be the Librarian of Congress, said that the reason, first of all, I think his history was probably wrong, but he believed that the reason that science arose in the West instead of the East, which is an arguable proposition to start with, but he said that was because we had a creator God. And the idea of imitatio Dei, of imitating God, meant that creating was itself sacred. So it's possible.
I don't know if I buy that story of the origin, but it's definitely true that the modern world has decided to celebrate innovation in ways that most ancient societies didn't. And in fact, innovation is more important to our world and our productivity.
Right.
And we economists will tell you, yeah, there's little that's more important to really economic growth and innovation. And if we could figure out more ways to celebrate and promote it, we probably should. And so to an economist, this is the sort of thing we want to treat as sacred, except when you treat it as sacred, you get sloppy with it. So there's a sense in which we don't celebrate the right kinds of innovation. That is, for example, there's the key distinction between invention and diffusion. And we celebrate invention far more than diffusion, but diffusion is actually where most of the action has always been.
Do you get sloppy with it because once it is called sacred, you're not allowed to criticize it the same way or analyze it the same way? Do you think that's why it's sloppy?
Well, so these are some of the correlates of the sacred is you simplify it, right? So when you have innovation, you just cram it all down to creativity, say. You don't realize there's all these other parts of innovation except creativity. You just say, no, it's all creativity, right? That's the way you simplify it. And then you set it apart. You think of there's the creative genius and there's business people, and they don't overlap. But in fact, of course, they all get mixed up. But you set it aside in that way. And then you idealize it in the sense of you just think it doesn't need all these other inputs. It usually does to actually work. Innovation needs a lot of other things. It can't just by itself glow in the sky and work. It has to be integrated into things. You need other incentives. And so these are some of the ways in which we are sloppy about innovation because we just revere innovation. We don't bother to pay attention to how we're not actually promoting it, how we're not actually helping it, because again, a key norm of the sacred is you just intuit it and feel it as opposed to analyze it. And so in some sense, people are bothered by analyzing creativity. They want to say, no, creativity is a spark of genius that comes from, comes from, the muses, and you shouldn't analyze it and you shouldn't calculate it, right? And so that gets in the way.
And there you have it.
Well, I feel we've talked for about an hour, so this might be about a reasonable length of time to talk. I thank you.
That would be great. I really enjoyed it.
Thank
you. Thank you.
And I'll put up a recording to this relatively soon.
Okay, just let me know and I will post it. And
all right.
I enjoyed reading. I read the paper twice so that I could grasp it. It was fascinating. So
thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. All right.
Take care.
Stopping the recording now.